welcome. I'm Vincent McCory in for SWU. It's Tuesday, May the 2nd. This is Africa 54. The United Nations is warning that the conflict in Sudan could force up to 800,000 people to flee into neighboring countries. The Kenyan self-proclaimed pastor accused of inciting followers to starve to death to meet Jesus faces terrorism charges over the deaths of more than 100 people. And sub-Saharan Africa grapples with growing diabetes cases, with 70% of people living with it unaware they have it. We'll talk to a doctor. These and more on today's Africa 54. We begin in Sudan, where a moment ago, warring military factions agreed on, in principle, to a 7-day ceasefire from Thursday, even as more airstrikes and shooting in the Khartoum region disrupted the latest short-term truce. A statement released by the Foreign Ministry of South Sudan said its president, Salva Kiir, stressed the importance of a longer truce and of naming envoys to peace talks, to which both sides had agreed. The credibility of the reported May 4th to 11th deal ceasefire between Sudanese Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and paramilitary Rapid Support Forces leader General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo was unclear given the rampant violations that undermined previous agreements. Sudan's war has forced 100,000 people to flee over its borders, and fighting now in its third week is creating a humanitarian crisis, according to UN officials. Anthony Labruto has more.
More than 100,000 refugees have fled Sudan to neighboring countries, according to United Nations officials. The increased fighting in the streets of Khartoum, now spreading to other parts of the country, has impacted all aspects of everyday life. UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Olga Sarrado, estimates this number will grow significantly in the weeks ahead.
So over 100,000 refugees are estimated to be among those who have now crossed to neighboring countries, including Sudanese refugees, South Sudanese returning, and other nationalities who were themselves refugees in Sudan. Alongside governments and partners, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has determined an initial planning figure of more than 800,000 refugees and returnees that may flee Sudan to neighboring countries.
Unlike conflicts in the past, the amount of internally displaced Sudanese in the country creates greater humanitarian needs.
At least 334,000 people have been internally displaced within Sudan as a result of the fighting since the 15th of April, according to IOM's Displacement Tracking Matrix Network report, which was released last night and has been disseminated to media here in Geneva. The number of displaced people through the last 2 weeks exceeds, as a result of conflict, exceeds all conflict-related displacements reported in Sudan in 2022, just to give you a sense of the scale of movement since April 15.
On Monday, the WFP announced that it will immediately lift the suspension of its operations in Sudan, put in place after the tragic deaths of its team members. The agency had temporarily halted all operations in Sudan after 3 of its employees were killed in clashes between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces on April 15th. Anthony Labruto, VOA News, Washington.
Well, joining us to talk about the situation on the ground today in Sudan is Akmal Tao of South Sudan, which is part of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, MBN. Like VOA, falls under the umbrella of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Akmal, welcome. And first, we now hear the two sides have agreed to yet another ceasefire. What is the word on the ground? What are you hearing from Khartoum?
Thank you for having me. Actually, now the situation in the ground, according to last report from there, in spite the ceasefire in Khartoum, but there is a clashes around the palace, main palace in Khartoum, and also about the the Khartoum airport and different areas in Khartoum North and Durman, the second city or the third city in the capital of Khartoum. Other things, until now, there is no reaction truly from the both sides about the calling from South Sudan president. But according to the reports that come from South Sudan government, they said the two sides, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, they agreed about the calling for a truce for 7 days.
Yes.
This is according from the South Sudan government.
And we hope this will hold. But we know that hundreds of thousands of people, up to 100,000, have left the country. But we hear of this over 300,000 internally displaced. What do you know about? Where are they? Where are they going? Are there camps being set up within Sudan?
No camps truly in the near places. People from Khartoum, they displaced to the nearest cities. Wad Madani in central Sudan, and also the near one state is North Sudan, and also at the middle of Sudan. People now, they are living in, according to our reporters in the ground, living in schools and also living with families. No camps until now.
Yeah, and very quickly, the whole question of this conflict possibly taking an ethnic or regional dimension. What are people saying? What are their fears?
Until now, people, they talking about everything now. It goes in the right way. If we take a look for the North Darfur Al-Fashir area, there is a truce actually starting from the first time from Eid al-Fitr, and until now it's going on. It comes only from the people themselves, not with the government or the two sides of the fighting. And until now, it's going on.
We'll keep watching the situation. Thank you very much, Akmal. That was Akmal Taha of South Sudan, part of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. Well, now, the United Nations has warned that 800,000 people may flee Sudan to escape fighting. Zachary Goldman has more.
Drone footage obtained by Reuters shows a massive pillar of smoke bellowing over the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, on Monday after airstrikes and artillery attacks. The United Nations on Monday warned the conflict in Africa's third most populous nation could force 800,000 people to flee into neighboring countries. Sudan's UN humanitarian coordinator Abdou Dieng warned of a, quote, full-blown catastrophe.
As you know, it has been more than 2 weeks of devastating fighting in Sudan, a conflict that is turning Sudan's humanitarian crisis into a full-blown catastrophe.
Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands wounded in battles that erupted between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, in the middle of April. Foreign governments have pulled out their citizens over the past week in a series of operations by air, sea, and land. Among them was Noor Kulab, who moved to Sudan 8 years ago to study medicine and was evacuated back to her home in the Gaza Strip just before she was supposed to graduate.
It was horror. When you see bodies scattered right and left, dismembered people, torched banks, you feel it is totally unsafe. I felt like the future was on hold and all my hard work while I was away from home disappeared in a glimpse. And in one day, all my hard work during 8 years has gone.
Sudanese civilians have fled into neighboring countries by the tens of thousands, raising fears the crisis could exacerbate regional instability.
Civilians continue to flee the fighting. Many of them are taking refuge in areas of the country that have not been as much affected by the conflict. The regional spillover effect of the crisis is of a serious concern.
Sudan's army chief and the head of the RSF had shared control of government after a 2021 coup, but fell out over a planned transition to civilian rule. Both sides agreed on Sunday to extend a truce by 72 hours, and the UN told Reuters they may hold truce talks in Saudi Arabia. But that truce has been interrupted by gunfire and artillery.
Well, to East Africa now, where Kenya's self-proclaimed pastor Paul Nthenge Mackenzie, accused of inciting followers to starve to death to meet Jesus, appeared in court Tuesday in the coastal town of Malindi. He faces terrorism charges over the deaths of more than 100 people found buried in what has been dubbed the Shakahola Forest Massacre, according to prosecutors. The small courtroom was packed with relatives of victims as Mackenzie was brought in along with 8 other defendants. After a brief hearing, the case was moved to the High Court in Kenya's second largest city of Mombasa, where the suspect will face terrorism charges, according to the prosecutor. Still there, the bodies of several children exhumed in eastern Kenya showed signs of starvation and, in some cases, asphyxiation. That's according to government pathologist. He spoke as investigators began the first autopsies on over 100 people linked to a doomsday cult. Rachel Faber has more.
The bodies of 9 children exhumed in eastern Kenya showed signs of starvation and asphyxiation, according to a government pathologist. Investigators have begun the first autopsies on over 100 people linked to a doomsday cult, whose bodies were discovered last month in shallow graves in the Shakahola Forest. Authorities say the dead were followers of the Good News International Church, led by Pastor Paul Mackenzie. He is accused of instructing worshippers to starve themselves to death in order to be the first to go to heaven before the end of the world. Mackenzie has been in police custody since April 14th, alongside 14 other suspected cult members. The deaths amount to one of the worst cult-related tragedies in recent history, and the death toll is expected to rise further, as the Kenyan Red Cross says more than 300 people have been reported missing. The Kenyan government says children account for most of the bodies recovered so far. On Sunday, President William Ruto said he would appoint a judicial commission of inquiry this week to investigate what happened.
Well, that was Rachel Faber of Reuters reporting. Now, as we count down to World Press Freedom Day on Wednesday, May 3rd, today we focus on the media situation in Mali. And for that, I'm joined here in studio by Modibo Dembele, Managing Editor, VOA Bambara. Welcome to Africa 54, Modibo.
Thank you, Vincent.
So now we know that the country of Mali has been called in some reports as a no-go zone for journalists. First, why is that? What does that mean for us as journalists?
Thank you so much. I think we know that some international broadcasters such as RFI, France 24 have been expelled from Mali because they got some clash with the government, especially regarding the way, according to the government, they were covering the ongoing political situation. And also, we notice also even in Mali, lately that some journalists have been also arrested. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I can say that in terms of freedom of press in Mali, so the government is really respecting the human right and also the relevant provision for the constitution, such as the press freedom.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the challenges that reporters and journalists and media houses face there? Because we know that the country is has been grappling with jihadism, then we have the government on one side.
The main one is the insecurity, which from the north shifted almost everywhere in the countries. Right now, the government is facing, they used to face like a rebel group, but right now we have Al-Qaeda, which almost spread all over the country, and they don't hesitate to kill reporters or kidnap them as bargaining tools. The latest example is the French journalist Olivier Dubois, who was abducted by Al-Qaeda, even though according to his statement, he got some appointment to do an interview with Al-Qaeda leader in Gao.
Mm-hmm. So we know that you are involved in covering Mali and the other journalists who try to get the stories out. How do those journalists manage to get around the obstacles and even the dangers?
Vincent, to be honest with you, is very difficult, especially for our stringers operating in an extreme north of Mali because of the insecurity, because in most of those areas, sometimes the army is not there, or even though if the army is there, they even have sometimes a tendency to avoid covering some topic because of fearing backlash from either jihadist group or even some of their bodies, which sometimes can anonymously report what they are doing. So those are the major issues that we are facing.
In terms of the past and the present, and how would you say, did things get worse in the last several years, or the last several months, or have things been a little bit dicey for reporters in Mali?
For reporter, I would say I don't want to really, since I'm not an expert in security issue, but in terms of getting information, even though we are facing those challenges, we are on a daily basis. We really do what we are supposed to do. But the only thing I can let you know is really is difficult sometimes getting information like in those areas in the north of Mali.
Well, really appreciate that, Modibo. That's Modibo Debele, is a managing editor, VOA Bambara. Well, now still to come, Somali-American restaurant owner in Minneapolis is named National Small Business Person of the Year. So stay with us.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, this week marks the 30th anniversary of World Press Freedom Day. We'll discuss the multiple crises that threaten press freedoms. Join me, Haiti Adams, for an in-depth analysis of freedom of the press in Africa on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Well, in other news, Uganda's parliament on Tuesday passed one of the world's strictest anti-LGBTQ bills after President Yoweri Museveni requested some parts of the original legislation be toned down. Now, despite some changes, the new bill retains most of the harshest measures of the legislation adopted in March, which drew condemnation from the United States, European Union, United Nations, and major corporations. Nigeria's government on Tuesday sought to overcome problems hampering the evacuation of around 3,000 of its nationals from Sudan, where rival military factions are battling for control. And FIFA legend and the World Health Organization's Goodwill Ambassador for Sport and Health, Didier Drogba, says football has the power to teach people from different backgrounds how to live together. The former Cote d'Ivoire and Chelsea forward was appearing alongside HRH Princess Reem bint Abdullah bin Mossad Al Saud of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at the Making Trade Score for Women event held on Tuesday in Geneva, Switzerland. Well, now a Somali-American restaurant owner in Minneapolis, Abdurrahman Kahim, was named the National Small Business Person of the Year. Mahmoud Maksadi in Minneapolis and Abdulaziz Osman in Washington follow up with the businessman and have this story narrated by Anthony Labruto.
At an awards ceremony Monday in Washington, D.C., Abdurrahman Kahim, the owner of Afro Deli and Grill restaurants in Minneapolis, was named by the Small Business Agency Administrator Isabella Castillas Guzman, saying that he reflects the best of American entrepreneurship. Abdurrahman has pursued the American dream of business ownership, overcoming challenges, launching multiple food businesses, pivoting during COVID, and lifting local neighborhoods along the way, Guzman said in a statement. On Monday, Kahim attended the National Small Business Week event at the White House, where he had an opportunity to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. The event spotlighted the impact small businesses make to the U.S. economy. Speaking to VOA as he was getting ready to board a plane back to Minneapolis, Kahim expressed his excitement for the award.
It's a huge honor for me and also for the community and the state of Minnesota. winning a national award is not, it doesn't come every day.
Abdirahman Kahin opened his first restaurant in 2010 and now has 4 restaurant chains across the Twin Cities. He has already become the Small Business Person of the Year for the state of Minnesota. Earlier, he told VOA that his win is something that he will cherish for the rest of his life.
For me, it's like a winning Olympic medal, because after 12 years and with a lot of tireless and sleepless nights, finally I get something that I can cherish. I can show to my kids. I can show to my community. It's a huge honor. It's not it's not like it's not like every day you win this kind of title.
Kahin, who emigrated to the U.S. in 1996, says this recognition proves that immigrant-run businesses contribute to the economy.
Sure that we as Somalis, people from Africa in general, are hardworking people. We are an asset for this country and for the state of Minnesota. So we want to make sure that we are accepted and that we have a lot to contribute to the state of Minnesota and this country.
The SBA Administrator Isabel Guzman and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff are due to visit Wednesday one of Kahin's restaurants in Minneapolis during a trip to Minnesota. During the pandemic, Abdirahman Kahin kept his kitchen open to feed the older members of the Somali community and their neighbors, along with other elderly and disabled Minnesotans who were stuck at home due to the spread of the COVID-19 coronavirus. Anthony Labruto for Mahmoud Muscad in Minneapolis and Abdulaziz Osman in Washington, VOA News.
Well, it's time now for our health report, and for that we turn to Kamiti Kibayasi. Welcome.
Thank you, Vincent. A quality high school education can transform a girl's future. Yet, worldwide, many adolescent girls miss part of high school or even drop out altogether for one simple reason: menstruation. Here's VOA Health. More information.
Blood, sweat, sebum. If they all meet together, they form a very good breeding ground for a lot of bacteria infections. So if you wash it, you're minimizing the chance of getting any infection, whatever cause. If, for example, you're even having a chemical laden pad, you can also reduce the risk by reducing contacts. People try to use soap and feminine wash, but water is the most important and hygienic thing you can use, because the vagina itself is self-cleaning. So there's actually no point. Water is what they recommend. But people that want to go a step further use intimate wash that is between the pH of 3.8, that's concentration of the intimate wash, between 3.8 to 4.5, which is like the natural pH of the vagina. But just use water, it will suffice. Let's not underestimate the power of water. Clean water is best, so that you don't introduce chemicals, more germs, or irritants to your private parts, which will cause more effects in the long term, like rashes and itching and infections.
Girls should not feel ashamed of their health. Normal development. The United Nations Children's Fund is a global leader in menstrual health and hygiene activities through development and humanitarian programs worldwide. It supports governments in building national strategies across sectors like health and education that account for menstrual health and hygiene. Back to you, Vincent.
Well, thank you very much, committee, for that informative report. Really useful. Well, now, thanks to Committee. Be sure to watch our health report every Tuesday right here on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.
We all know the rights of women in many parts of the world are under threat and under attack. Repressive governments are passing targeted laws to restrict women's fundamental freedoms, including the right to free speech and assembly. In far too many parts of the world, women and girls still do not have equal opportunities to study and work. Women journalists, advocates, politicians, and others are subject to persistent online harassment and abuse. Women who are victims of violence often do not have equal access to justice. Women are subject to discrimination that often puts them at a disadvantage. Through our diplomacy, we're committed to supporting them and advancing gender equality worldwide.